Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Samach Dalid concludes the discussion about bringing a carbon when you have chametz in your possession. The Gemara is, we will begin a few lines into the Daf where the Gemara quotes the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah and Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara will explain and analyze their sources. Then we get to our next Mishnah, which describes at length the process of the bringing of the carbon Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Gemara will go through the steps bit by bit and explain or analyze some of the things that the Mishnah says. Okay, so first of all, we have seen that the halacha is you're not allowed to bring a carbon Pesach when you have chametz in your possession. If you do, it passels it. As long as everything else about the carbon Pesach is okay, having chametz in your possession is a psal. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says that also applies to the carbon tamid. How does he know that? So Gemara says because the word zivchi is used in the pasuk to describe the sister. It says "Lo-sizbach al chametz dam zivchi." The word zivchi means my carbon. It also applies to another thing called my carbon, which is the carbon tamid, which the word zivchi is used there as well. Now Rabbi Shimon says that it applies to every carbon. Any carbon that you're going to bring throughout Pesach, you can't have chametz in your possession. If you do, it passels the carbon. On Erev Pesach, though, it only passes a carbon Pesach, it doesn't pass anything else. So the Gemara, where does Rabbi Shimon get this halacha from? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon notes that it says the word zivchi twice, which means my carbon, and we take the two yuds and we put them together in one word, and it becomes zvachai, my carbonos plural, my many carbonos. Therefore, he says it applies not only to the carbon tamid, but to all carbonos. They're all included in the many carbonos that this psal of not owning chametz applies to. Now, that would tell me that this Isser applies. How do I know that it's only on Pesach itself and not on Erev Pesach? So Rabbi Shimon says, well, why did the Torah write it in this funny way? Write Zivchi twice, he's supposed to take the Yud from one and put it on the other, make it Zvachai. Why don't you just tell me straight? Loi Sishach al Chametz Dam Zvachai, my plural carbonates. The reason for that is because we are saying that the carbon, the Zivchi, and the Zvachai are mutually exclusive. The only time that there is a prohibition on zvachai on the other karbanos is when the prohibition of chametz doesn't apply to the carbon pesach itself. At the time when the carbon pesach has an isser of chametz, the other karbanos do not. So therefore it works out as follows. On Erev Pesach, which is the proper time for bringing a carbon pesach, and if you bring it then and you own chametz, it's pasul. That halacha does not apply to any other karbanos. If you bring other karbanos on that day and you own chametz, you don't pasul them. However, on the rest of Pesach, where you can't bring a carbon pesach, if you bring a carbon pesach any other day besides for the 14th of Nisan, it's possible because it's the wrong time, and therefore you don't have any isser of bringing a carbon Pesach when you own chametz, because you're not bringing a carbon Pesach, you're bringing a pasul carbon. Therefore, that isser doesn't apply to the carbon Pesach, but in a situation like that, it does apply to other karbanos. You cannot bring tmidim and shlamim and all kinds of other things when you own chametz on the rest of Pesach itself. Now the Gemara discusses the next line in the Mishnah, and we're asking what happens if I take my carbon Pesach, I set it aside, I set this animal aside to be a carbon Pesach, I didn't bring it in the correct time, and now I bring it on Pesach itself. So if I bring it as a carbon Pesach, so then it's definitely the wrong time and it's pasul, and therefore there's no isser of bringing chametz, of owning chametz while you're bringing it, because it's a pasul carbon anyway. Now the Mishnah goes ahead and says, but if you bring it as a shlamim, then it's kasher. It reverts automatically to being a shlamim. You bring it as a shlamim, it's a kasher carbon. Kasher carbon, while you own chametz on Pesach, you violate the isser of leis yishach al chametz dam zivchi. Says the Gemara, what happens if I don't say anything? I take the carbon Pesach animal and I just bring it. Do we say we should have said that it's automatically a shlamim and therefore you violate the isser? It's a kasher shlamim. But the implication doesn't seem to be the way. The implication seems to be you have to bring it as a shlamim, then you violate the isser because it's a kasher shlamim. If you don't say anything, then it's pasul, seems to be the implication. Says the Gemara, why? The Gemara says it seems to indicate that the Pesach stays a Pesach until you turn it into a shlamim. It doesn't turn automatically into a shlamim. You have to make it into a shlamim. And therefore, if you bring it without saying anything, it's still a Pesach and it's pasul. And therefore there's no isser of loy sishchad al chametz dam zevchi. Says Gemara, not necessarily. We could be talking about a situation where it stayed a carbon Pesach, even though most things will revert automatically to a shlamim. Most things revert to a shlamim because you can't bring it as a Pesach anymore. If somebody, however, is Chayv in Pesach Sheni because he was Tameh, let's say, at the time of the Korban Pesach, so then he still could bring his animals to Korban Pesach. He's not done. When it comes the next opportunity to bring it, in the month of Iyar, when he has Pesach Sheni, he'll bring it then. So the animal is still a Pesach. If he brings it then, it didn't revert to a Shlamim. It's only going to be problematic if he went ahead and he said, I'm bringing it as a Shlamim. Then it's a Shlamim in a time where it's kosher to bring a Shlamim and he violates the Isser. But if he's bringing it as a Pesach on Chol Hamoed, on Yom Tov, then there's no Isser and it still stays a Pesach because he still could bring it during Pesach Sheni. Okay, now we begin the next Mishnah, which discusses and describes the procedure, everything that happened in the Beis HaMikdash at the time that the Korban was brought. So, first, the Gemara says the halacha is that we have to divide Klal Yisrael up into 3 groups, and each group went into the Azara one at a time. When one group left, the other one came in. How do you know that? Because it says, V'shachto esay kol kahal adas Yisrael. Kahal is one group, adas is another group, Yisrael is the third group. Now, the Gemara says when the first group came in and when the Azara was filled, the gates were locked. And they started bringing the korban of the first group. They blew shofar, tekiah through a tekiah. Now the Kahanim stood in 2 rows, stretching from the shechita, from the place where the animals were slaughtered, to the mizbeach. One row had only bowls of silver. One row had only bowls of gold. They were careful not to mix them. The Gemara will explain why. One had to be pure silver, one had to be pure gold. Now, the bowls that they had did not have a bottom. They were rounded at the bottom. You couldn't put them down. The reason for that is we were afraid if you could put them down, you would put them down, and then the blood would harden and would never end up getting thrown on the mizbeach, and that would be a puzzle korban because it didn't have its blood thrown like it's supposed to be. Now, how did the procedure actually happen? So the shechita could be performed by Yisrael, didn't have to be performed by a Kohen. From the catching of the blood in the bowl onward, it was done by Kohanim only, so the Kohen would catch the blood, he would pass it to the next Kohen in line, and it would travel along the line until it gets to the Mizbeach. The one next to the Mizbeach would then throw the blood, he would splash it against the Mizbeach, against the wall of the Mizbeach, and one of the 2 sides where there was a yisoid, where there was a frame around the bottom of it, that's the north and west side. Then he would pass back the empty bowl. So Kahanim along the line were receiving full bowls and passing in, receiving empty bowls and passing it. As we shall see, the Gemara said he had to do the full bowl first. Now, when they finished all of this, the first group left and the second group came in. The second group left when they finished and the third group came in. All 3 groups were exactly the same as far as this is concerned. Now, Hallel was sung. They began Hallel at the beginning of each group. If they finished the Hallel before all the Korbanos were finished, they sang it again. Had they needed to do it a third time, they would have, but it never happened. Now, Rabbi Yehuda adds, the third group was always less than the other 2 groups because it was just whatever was left over from the first 2. It wasn't a full Azara, and therefore they never got to Ahafta Ki Yishma, as even in the first time through Hallel, they didn't get that far. The Kohanim worked very quickly. Now, on Shabbos, everything was the same. The only thing is that they washed the floor of the Azara. There was a stream that ran through the Azara, and what they would do is they would stop up the hole where it leaves, and that would cause the entering water to flood the floor of the Azara, and then they would release the hole and it would all run out. That's how they washed the floor. The Gemara says the Chachamim were not happy about doing that on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says it was something else they weren't happy about. They used to scoop up a cupful of the blood that spilled on the floor and pour it, throw it on the Mizbeach, and the Chachamim weren't happy about that. The Gemara will explain why. Now, the next thing that had to be done was the korban had to be skinned and the parts had to be taken out. So there was a series of hooks set on poles in the northern part of the Azara. They would hang them from the tendon of the leg. They would strip it, skin it, and pull out the organs. If there weren't enough hooks available, then they had sticks, and 2 people would suspend the korban by the stick. The stick would be held up by their shoulders. It would stretch from the shoulders of one to the shoulder of the other. The korban would hang between them from the stick, and then they would do all the work on it that way. If it was Shabbos, they couldn't use the sticks, so instead they would use their arms. One would put his arm on his friend's shoulder, he would put his arm on my shoulder, and that's how they would hold up the korban. Now they stripped it, they skinned it, they took out the organs, they put it on a special tray, then they were brought to the Mizbeach and put into the fire. And of course, when the first group was finished, if it was Shabbos, they went out and they waited on the Har Habayis, and the second group waited on the Chel, that's within the low wall called the Soreg. It's slightly closer to the Azara itself. And now why did they wait? Because they couldn't go home, they couldn't carry the Karbanis home. It was Shabbos, and also they couldn't roast it yet, because at roast and Shabbos have to wait till after Shabbos itself. Okay, now the Gemara begins analyzing these activities one at a time. So first of all, we said that the carbon has to be brought in 3 groups. Says the Gemara, the 3 groups have to have at least 10 people each, because it says Kahal ve'eda Yisrael. A Kahal is 10, and Eda is 10, and Yisrael is 10. So it's got to be 10 each. And also, we're not sure if the 3 groups are supposed to be all at the same time, or if they're supposed to be one after the other. So in order to make sure we filled both halachas, we had 3 groups, and each one had 30 people. That way each group had 3 groups of 10 at the same time. And you also had 3 groups, one after the other, of at least 10. That way we're fulfilling both halachas. Says the Gemara, you could really do it with only 50 people. You don't have to have 3 groups of 30, which is 90 people, because you could have the groups rotate 10 at a time, meaning you have 30 go in, then 10 of them shacht and leave, and then another group of 10 comes in, shacht, and a group of 10 that leaves, and then the third group comes in. That way you have 3 different cycles. Each cycle has a minimum of 10, and at the time of each particular shechita, you have 30 people in there at once. So you need a minimum of 50, but as we shall see later, there were many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of karbanos. They weren't talking about numbers in the 50s. Okay, says the Gemara further, the first group came in, the Mishnah said, and the doors were locked. Now, there's a machlokes here, Abaye and Rava, what the word is it ninalu or ninalin? The difference is, ninalu would mean that they locked themselves. That's Abaye. They were b'derech nes, miraculously locked themselves when it was full, and they kept everybody else out. Rava said, no, the people there had to come and say, okay, it's full, nobody else, you have to wait for the next group, and then they would lock it themselves. What's the machlokes about? Do we rely on a miracle to happen? Do we not rely on a miracle to happen? Now the Gemara quotes a Mishnah, which is on a totally different subject, and it tangentially mentions the locking of the Azara, and the question is, how are each of them going to read it? So the Mishnah is talking about an incident in which a Kavya ben Mahalalel did something with, he gave sota water to somebody that they felt weren't supposed to get, and the Chachamim put him in Chayrim. That's according to one report. Now Rav Yehuda says it can't be. A Kavya ben Mahalalel could not have been put into Chayrim, because the Azara was never locked on somebody in Yisrael as great in wisdom and fear of sin as a Kavya ben Mahalalel. So now you see it says the Azara was never locked. What does that mean? What does that language mean? The Azara was never locked. So Abaye, who says that it locked itself, says it was never locked is referring to after it was locked. It was never in a state of lockedness with somebody in there greater than a Kavya ben Mahalal, meaning to say that a Kavya ben Mahalal was the greatest person in Klal Yisrael. Everybody in Klal Yisrael was locked into the Azara at some point, and a Kavya was the greatest of them all. Now, Rava says it was never locked, meaning the action of locking, not the state of being locked, the action of locking. No, the doors were never locked actively. Nobody ever locked them on a group which contained somebody greater than a Kavya ben Mahalal, because he was the greatest of them all. So again, according to Abaye, it's referring to the state of locked after the action of locking. According to Rava, it's referring to the action of locking, because people did that. It wasn't something that happened by itself miraculously. Okay, says the Gemara describing it further, we bring a brisa that says that although there were tremendous crowds there, nobody ever got crushed, except for in the days of Hillel, that one old man got crushed, and they called that the Pesach Ma'uchin, the crushed Pesach. Says the Gemara, another incident, Agrippas, the king, at some point wanted to take a census of how many people there were, and he told the Kohanim to take the kidneys of the Karbanos and count it that way. So they collected all the kidneys of all the Karbanos, and they found that there were 600,000 pairs of kidneys. That's one kidney from each animal. There were 120,000 animals. Each animal had at least 10 people registered to it, so we have at least 1.2 million people that are registered to Karbanos Pesach, not counting all the Timeim and people who were far away that could not be registered. Now the Gemara asks, how are they allowed to take the kidneys away? The kidneys have to go on the mizbech. So the Gemara says, no problem, they burn them afterwards. The Gemara says, you mean that they threw them all in a pile together, but you're not allowed to burn kidneys with other kidneys, you're not allowed to burn any parts, you're not allowed to mix parts of karbanos together. So the Gemara says, okay, no, they burn them separately. The Gemara says, what do you mean? The kidneys have to be burned together with the other organs of its animal. The animal's organs all have to be burned at once. So the Gemara says, you're right, they didn't take the kidneys away, they just noted the kidney and it took some other mark or indication for each kidney that they saw so that they could keep count of it. Okay, next, the Mishnah said that the Kohanim stood in rows and there was a row of only silver kalim and a row of only gold kalim. Why that hakpada? So the Gemara says perhaps the concern is that somebody will end up taking a silver one in exchange for a gold one. You'll give him the gold, he'll give the gold one and take back a silver one. That means that we are trading a higher quality, a higher expense, a higher value kli for a lower value kli. You're not allowed to do that in the Beis HaMikdash. Where it says that can't be a problem, obviously, because then you, even within the gold kalim, you could have ones of different value, and that may end up happening. So obviously that's not a problem, because we're only saying the only halacha you can't trade higher quality for lower quality is within one carbon. Here, each bowl held its own carbon's blood, and therefore you don't have such a problem. Versus the reason is because it was more aesthetically pleasing to have one row of all gold and one row of all silver. The kalim flashed by in a blur, so you could literally see a line of gold and a line of silver. It was nice to have them separately and not be a mix. Okay, we said that the bowls that held it didn't have a bottom. They were rounded at the bottom. They weren't flat, so you couldn't put it down. Says the Gemara, all these bowls in the Beis HaMikdash were rounded at the bottom. We don't want any of them to be put down except for the one that holds the spices that go on the lechem hapanim. Because if you would put it on the lechem hapanim, it wouldn't be able to stand straight. It would end up leaning on the lechem hapanim bread, and the lechem hapanim bread was shaped like a shoebox with only two sides, the two ends that have sides, and we're afraid the walls would collapse if the bowls leaned upon them. Okay, next the mission said that the shechita is performed by Yisrael, and then it says v'kibel hakohen, a little bit strange. It says Yisrael, then it says Kohen. Gemara says this is to tell me that from the catching of the blood and onwards it has to be done by Kohanim. Gemara brings a pasuk elsewhere to derive this, for that all the blood avodas, which is catching the blood, transporting the blood to the mizbech, and placing the blood on the mizbech, all it has to be done by Kohanim. Now, Mishnah also described how it was passed from hand to hand, from Kohen to Kohen. Gemara says, why do you need to describe that? Gemara says, it's teaching me that the mitzvah of halacha, bringing blood, does not require you to move towards the mizbech. It only requires you to move the kli towards the mizbech, and passing it to somebody else is okay. Gemara says that's not necessarily what the chiddush is. It could be that that's not entirely true. It could be that each Kohen had to move slightly towards the Beis HaMikdash, at least a little bit, at least an inch, or so that at least he's moving in the direction of the mizbech, and that he actually is doing halacha. But the chiddush over here is, the reason why it's describing it is to teach me that we want as many people involved as possible, because Rov Hadras Melech, a multitude of people, the more people there are, the more honor it is for the king. Okay, Gemara says that he would receive the full one and then the empty one. Gemara says it had to be in that order. If there was a full one available to be taken, the Kohen had to take it right away. He couldn't say 1 second, I'm first going to pass this empty one coming from the other direction. He can't say that, because the mitzvah is to take the full ones, and you don't let a mitzvah wait. Passing back the empty ones is not a mitzvah. It's just recharging the ability to send. So the mitzvah has to be done first. You couldn't let it wait, and that's why they had to take the full one as soon as it was available, and only afterwards do the empty one. Okay, now the Kohen who was closest to the mizbeach threw it on the wall of the mizbeach. The Gemara says that it had to be thrown, it had to be splashed. It couldn't be poured. How do you know that? It doesn't say that. The Gemara says in the carbon of the Bukhar, it does say that. And it says tizrok, it has to be splashed. And it says there damam and chabam. It says plural. So that's to teach me that other karbanos also have to be splashed. Now, the only carbon that it says otherwise is the carbon chatas, where we know that the Kohen took one finger and sprinkled it. But all other karbanos, which include the carbon Bukhar, Meiser, and Pesach, have to be splashed, and that's how we know that. Okay, now how do you know that it had to be on the side where there is a yisod, where there's a frame foundation, which is, like we said, the west and the north? So Rabbi Eliezer says it comes from the use of the word zrika. Zrika has to be a good Zrika. It says V'ezdamim tizrag al mizbeach, and it says V'zork b'nei har ha'kohanim ezdamim al ha-mizbeach. We're connecting the word Zrika, which we use to learn this halacha, to the word Zrika that is used elsewhere, and that is by a carbon ola. So carbon ola, it has to be on the side where there's a yesod, and therefore this Zrika also, this throwing of the blood also has to be on the side where there's yesod, where there's the frame at the bottom. Where it says, how do you know that an ola has to be inside where there's yesod? Where it says, well, the pasuk says, well, yesod ha-mizbeach ha-ola. The Yesod Mizbeach Ola teaches me that the splashing of the blood of the Ola has to be where there's a Yesod, where there is this frame at the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.